Welcome to our deep dive. Today it's all about managing stress, especially when it feels like it just never ends.
Yeah, something we all deal with.
Exactly. And you know what's awesome? You sent over this guide, Managing Stress Under Continuous Pressure.
Oh, yeah, that one.
And it's not just like typical tips, that gets into the why, like the actual brain science behind it.
It's super interesting how our brains work with stress.
I know. And so this deep dive, we're going to go through it together, see what we can learn.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the guide starts with this idea of prevention, like building up your stress resistance before things get crazy.
Yeah, that's key.
And they emphasize having a strong support system.
Makes sense.
But it's not just, feel-good advice. There's actually research that shows talking to someone can actually relieve stress.
Like venting.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like a pressure valve for our brains.
What do you think?
It is kind of like that, but it's actually more than just venting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when you talk to someone who gets it, someone supportive, it actually calms the amygdala.
To what now? The amygdala, it's like the alarm center of your brain.
Oh, okay.
And on top of that, your brain releases oxytocin, which calms you down and helps you bond.
So it's like a biological reset button.
Exactly. It reminds us that, we're not meant to go through tough times alone.
I like that. So you're saying connecting with people when we're stressed is actually natural.
Totally. In fact, the guide talks about this thing called tend and befriend.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. I always thought it was more of like a girl thing.
It's definitely not just for women. Tend and befriend is like a human instinct when we're stressed.
So it's about seeking support not just for women, but for everyone.
Exact. It's like built into us.
Interesting. Okay, so moving on. The guide also talks about lifestyle habits. The usual suspects.
Like sleep, diet, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But the thing that really jumped out at me was the emphasis on exercise.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, they even say just a 10-minute walk can help you focus better because it gets the blood flowing to your brain.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is that why, like, when I'm on a walk, I suddenly get all these ideas?
Maybe. Exercise is like hitting the reset button for your stress response.
Oh.
It's like it mimics that fight or flight response, but in a controlled way.
I see. So you're saying it's like a stress workout that prepares us for real-life stress.
Pretty much. And what's really cool is that the guide says regular exercise makes your brain and body better at handling stress overall.
So it's not just a quick fix. It's about building up that tolerance over time.
Exactly. It's like training for a marathon, but for stress.
I like that analogy. Okay, so the guide also mentions these in-the-moment techniques.
Like what?
Well, one that I thought was interesting was just pausing and taking a deep breath before you react to something stressful.
Yeah, that can be tough sometimes.
I know, right? But the guide actually quotes the American Heart Association. They recommend counting to 10 before reacting.
I've heard that before.
Do you think something that simple can really help?
It might seem simple, but it's actually pretty powerful. That pause you take it interrupts your immediate reaction.
You mean like that knee-jerk reaction that's usually driven by emotions?
Exactly. And it gives your prefrontal cortex time to catch up.
Prefrontal what now?
It's the thinking part of your brain, the one that's supposed to be rational.
Oh, right, right.
Mm.
So it's like hitting the pause button on your internal panic before it spirals out of control.
Exactly. And those deep breaths, they actually activate your parasympathetic nervous system.
Which is?
It's the calming system in your body, like the opposite of that fight or flight thing.
Oh, wow. So it's like flipping a switch from freak out to, I got this.
Yeah, pretty much.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing the guide talks about is emotional regulation and how blame, even though it's tempting, is actually never helpful.
Sure that.
And they suggest using I statements instead of you statements.
Like instead of saying, you always make me late, you say, I feel stressed when we're running behind.
Right, but does simply changing how we say things actually make a difference in how we handle those stressful moments?
Well, the guide says that I statements shift the focus from attacking to collaborating. Oh, interesting.
You're basically communicating your needs without blaming anyone.
Okay, but doesn't it sound a little, therapy-ish to use I statements all the time?
Yeah, you don't want to overuse them.
Yeah.
But when you use them the right way, they can really help you communicate better, especially when things are tense.
That makes sense. Okay, now, something else I wanted to touch on is this idea of tracking your stress triggers.
Oh, yeah, like figuring out what sets you off.
Right. And the guide suggests keeping a stress journal.
Like a diary for your stress.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It sounds a little like homework, but I can see how being self-aware is important.
Totally. It's like if something's broken, you can't fix it unless you know it's wrong.
True. But honestly, who has time for journaling these days?
I know it can seem like a lot, but even just taking a few minutes each day to write down what stressed you out and why can be super helpful.
Do you really think so?
Yeah, you might start to see patterns you didn't even realize were there.
Like realizing that a certain type of meeting always stresses you out. Exactly. Or maybe it's a specific task or even just a certain time of
I
day.
guess I could see that. So it's about
Yeah.
becoming a stress detective and figuring out what our triggers are so we can come up with a plan.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Right. Okay, now one last thing before we move on. The guide talks about the importance of a positive mindset.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I'll admit it sounded a little cheesy to me at first, but then they cited research about how an optimistic outlook can actually reduce stress levels.
So, like, thinking I can handle this can actually make a difference.
Yeah, but is that just wishful thinking or is there something more to it?
It's not about pretending everything's perfect. It's more about choosing where you focus your attention.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? It's easy to say think positive, but when you're stressed, it's hard to flip that switch.
It is tough.
Mm.
The guide uses this analogy of a camera lens. You can either zoom in on all the negative stuff and let it consume you,
Cool.
or you can widen the frame and see the bigger picture,
Yeah.
including the good stuff.
Ah, I see. So it's about remembering that even when things are tough, there's still things to be grateful for.
Exactly. And it's not just about thinking positive, it's also about taking action, focusing on what you can control.
So it's a combination of mindset and action.
Right. You got to believe you can handle it and then actually take steps to do something about it.
This guide is seriously packed with good stuff.
Yeah.
And I love how it explains the why behind the tips.
Me too. It's refreshing to see something that's so holistic.
Yeah.
It's not just about band-aid solutions. It's about understanding how stress works.
Totally. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so valuable for our listeners. It's not just about giving you a bunch of tips, it's about giving you the tools to actually manage stress effectively.
For sure.
We've covered a lot of ground already,
Right.
but there's still so much more to explore in this guide. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive back into the fascinating world of stress management.
So before the break, we were talking about how understanding the science of stress can be really empowering.
Yeah, and I remember the guide talked about the brain's like circuitry involved in stress, but I gotta be honest, it kind of went over my head.
Oh yeah, that can be a little complex.
Can we go back to that? I feel like if I get how it all works, maybe it'll help me manage it better.
Totally. So picture this. You encounter something stressful, right?
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right away, your amygdala, this little almond-shaped part of your brain, jumps into action.
That's the amygdala, right?
Yep, that's like your brain's alarm system constantly scanning for threats.
And if it senses danger, it triggers that whole fight or flight response, right?
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. The amygdala signals the hypothalamus.
Hold on, too many big words.
No worries. Basically, the hypothalamus then activates the pituitary and adrenal glands.
Ah, okay.
And all of that leads to your body getting flooded with adrenaline and cortisol.
The stress hormones.
Bingo.
Oh.
But here's the thing. Those hormones were designed for dealing with like immediate threats.
Like a bear chasing you or something?
Right. Not the kind of stuff we usually stress about today.
So you're saying our stress response is kind of outdated?
In a way, yeah. The guide calls it stress overload because we're dealing with chronic, low-level stressors all the time.
Which can't be good for us.
Definitely not. When those stress hormones are always pumping, it messes with your physical and mental health.
Like how? I mean, I know stress makes me feel anxious and irritable,
Yeah.
but what else does it do?
Well, it can disrupt your sleep, mess with your digestion, even weaken your immune system.
Seriously?
Yep. And long term, it increases the risk of things like heart disease and diabetes.
Okay. Wow. And mentally.
Mentally, it can lead to anxiety and depression trouble, concentrating, even memory problems.
So chronic stress is no joke.
Nope, not at all. But the good news is the guide talks about the brain's plasticity.
Plasticity.
Yeah, it means your brain can actually change and adapt.
So even if we've been super stressed, we can still like undo some of the damage.
That's the idea. By learning healthy coping mechanisms, we can counteract some of those negative effects.
So it's not a life sentence. We can actually train our brains to handle stress better.
Absolutely. And the guide gives a bunch of strategies for doing just that.
Like what?
Well, exercise is a big one. Studies show it literally boosts blood flow to the brain, which strengthens the prefrontal cortex,
Which is?
the part of your brain that handles emotional regulation and clear thinking.
So all those times I've forced myself to go to the gym, I was actually giving my brain a stress-busting workout too.
Pretty much. And it's not just the gym. The guide also talks about mindfulness meditation.
Meditation. Seriously.
Yeah, it's been shown to reduce activity in the amygdala and increase gray matter in the prefrontal cortex.
So it's like a mental workout for handling stress.
Exactly. You're building up mental muscle.
I like that.
Hmm.
And speaking of connections, we talked earlier about how important it is to have a strong support system.
Yeah, that's crucial.
But how does that actually work in the brain? What happens when we connect with others?
Well, it's pretty fascinating. When we feel connected and supported, our brains release oxytocin.
Isn't that like the love hormone?
Yeah, sometimes it's called the cuddle hormone, too.
So are you saying that just hanging out with friends can actually reduce stress?
It can. Oxytocin has a calming effect on the brain and body. It dials down the activity in the amygdala, lowers those stress hormones, and makes you feel more trusting and, just overall better.
Wow, so biologically, we're actually wired to seek out connection when we're stressed.
It's like built into our system.
This is all so interesting. It
Yeah.
really makes you realize that we have more control over our stress than we think.
The guide is full of strategies like that. Remember, though, it's a journey. Building resilience takes time.
It's not like we can just snap our fingers and become stress-free.
Right. It's about developing healthy habits and coping skills to get through those tough times.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And speaking of progress, the guide also goes into specific strategies for managing stress at work and in our personal lives.
Yeah, let's talk about those practical tips. Work is a huge source of stress for a lot of people.
No doubt. So the guide starts with identifying your specific triggers.
Oh, right, like that stress journal we talked about.
Yeah, that comes in handy here. By tracking those stressful moments, you can start to see patterns.
Like for me, I've noticed that back-to-back meetings with no breaks just totally wipe me out.
Yeah, I feel that.
And tight deadlines, especially when they involve last-minute requests, just send my anxiety through the roof.
Makes sense. So maybe it's a certain type of meeting or task or even just a time of day that gets you.
Yeah, once you know what sets you off, you can actually start doing something about it.
Exactly. It's like becoming a stress detective.
I love that analogy.
So let's say those back-to-back meetings are killing you. Could you maybe ask for short breaks in between?
That's a good idea. I always feel like I have to be so accommodating and efficient that I forget to prioritize my own needs.
Yeah, sometimes you got to put yourself first.
And for those last-minute requests, maybe I could talk to my boss about setting clearer expectations and deadlines.
Communication is key. Sometimes just talking about it can make a huge difference.
Right. But sometimes it's not about avoiding stress altogether. It's about managing it better.
For sure. The guide talks about breaking down large tasks into smaller, more manageable steps.
Oh yeah, that's classic time management. Makes things less overwhelming,
Right. It prevents you from feeling overwhelmed in the first place.
which is like the opposite of what we want.
Exactly. And it also emphasizes prioritizing tasks.
Because let's be real, we can't do everything at once.
Nope. It's about focusing on what's truly important and letting go of the rest or delegating if you can.
Delegation is definitely something I need to work on. I tend to want to control everything
It's a common trap, but sometimes saying no is the best thing you can do.
for your own sanity.
Exactly. And speaking of sanity, the guide also talks about taking breaks throughout the day to recharge.
Oh yeah, those little micro breaks can be lifesavers.
Even just a few minutes to step away, stretch, take some deep breaths, it can make a world of difference.
It's like hitting the reset button,
Exactly. And it helps prevent burnout.
which is definitely something I want to avoid. And the guide also talks about setting boundaries between work and personal life.
Oh, yeah, that's huge these days.
It's so easy to let work bleed into everything.
Yeah.
What tips does the guide have for setting those boundaries?
Well, it's about creating clear lines like designated work hours that you actually stick to.
And like having work-free zones in your home?
Yeah, that can help. It's about setting limits and giving yourself permission to disconnect.
It's about prioritizing your well-being.
Right. It takes effort, but it's so worth it.
Okay, so we've talked about work stress, but what about stress in our personal lives?
Yeah, that's a whole other beast.
Sometimes it feels like life itself is one giant stressor.
Tell me about it. Family finances, relationships, the constant influx of information, it can be overwhelming.
So what does the guide say about managing all that? So we were talking about how stress isn't just a work thing, it's like a life thing.
Totally. And, the guide points out how we often think of stress as just mental or emotional,
Right in our heads.
but it really affects us physically, too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like my heart starts racing and I get this tight feeling in my chest when I'm stressed.
It's like your body's freaking out, right? Totally. It's like it's betraying me.
It's not betrayal, it's just those ancient survival mechanisms kicking in.
Survival mechanism.
Yeah, like increased heart rate, tense muscles, rapid breathing.
Yeah.
It's all meant to prepare you for action, fight or flight,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. But Like we said before, most of our stress isn't the kind we can punch or run away from.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So all that energy and tension gets stuck with nowhere to go.
Well, that makes sense.
That's why the guide talks about finding healthy outlets for that stuff.
Like exercise.
Exercise, yeah, deep breathing, meditation, things like that.
I've definitely noticed that even just going for a walk helps when I'm stressed.
It's not just in your head. Those practices actually help regulate your nervous system.
So it's like bringing your body back into balance.
Exactly. But the guide goes deeper than just quick fixes. It's about developing a deeper awareness of how your body reacts to stress.
So paying attention to those little cues.
Yes, like that tightness in your chest you mentioned,
Ugh.
or a clenched jaw, headaches, an upset stomach, even that bone-deep exhaustion.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling. Those are all signs. The guide encourages us to listen to those signs and respond with self-care.
So basically treat ourselves with kindness.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting concept from the guide, emotional intelligence, or EQ.
EQ. I thought that was more about being, you know, emotional.
It is about emotions, but it's more about being skillful with them, understanding your own emotions and other people's emotions.
So like being able to read the room and also read yourself.
That's a great way to put it. And the guide says that EQ is super important for managing stress.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example.
Okay, so let's say someone with high EQ is facing a tough deadline.
It's in there.
They're more likely to know their stress triggers, like maybe they procrastinate,
Oh yeah, I do that.
and they're better at catching those early warning signs like getting irritable or having trouble focusing.
So they're like stress forecasters. They see it coming.
Exactly. They also can name their emotions. Instead of just feeling overwhelmed, they can say, hey, I'm feeling anxious because...
Putting words to it.
Yes. And just doing that can actually help calm things down.
It's like having a better vocabulary for your feelings.
Totally. And because they understand their own emotions, they're better at communicating their needs too.
Like saying, I need some space to focus right now, instead of letting it build up and explode later.
Right. It's huge for preventing burnout.
So EQ isn't just about being nice. It's a real tool for managing stress, especially in relationships.
Absolutely. And the guide says that we can actually develop our EQ.
Really? How?
It takes practice, mindfulness, self-reflection, active listening, even asking others for feedback on how you handle your emotions.
So it's like working out your emotional muscles.
That's a great way to think about it.
This has been such an amazing deep dive. I've learned so much from this guide you sent.
I'm glad you're finding it helpful. One last thing from the guide that really stuck with me. Managing stress is a journey, not a destination.
It's not about being perfect. It's about getting better over time.
Exactly. Some days you'll feel amazing, other days not so much. That's just life.
The key is to be kind to ourselves through it all right.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep trying new things, and celebrate those little victories along the way.
It's not about becoming some Zen master. It's about building a life where we can handle whatever comes our way.
Well said. This guide is all about empowering you to take control of your stress.
And I think our listeners will really appreciate that. So if you're feeling overwhelmed out there, remember, you're not alone.
There are tools and strategies that can help. You just got to find what works for you.
This deep dive has given you a great starting point. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep taking care of yourself.
And remember, stress is a part of life. It's how we manage it that makes all the difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into stress management. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving.